Okay. Okay, so these are our goals for this workshop: to present general concepts, to talk about HL classes specifically. And it's not going to be a workshop because there's so many of you and time is short. So it's more like a lecture with some participation. I hope that's okay. So let's start with the 3 must-dos of HL teaching. You want to expand broad-based or functional proficiency. You want to design curriculum and activities that respond to HL learners' motivations, goals, and life experiences. And you want to start with the curriculum, with the learner, not the curriculum. By that, I mean you want to differentiate instruction. Now, you might be saying to yourself, oh, okay, great, but that's not unique to HL teaching. That's what you want to do with every language teaching situation, right? You want to do it with L2 teaching. You want to expand functional proficiency. You want to address the reasons why your learners come to the classroom, and you want to differentiate instruction. True, but when it comes to HL teaching, there are details that are very different from those that happen in L2 teaching. And this is a preview of what we're going to look at today. You want to apply the from-to principles, macro-based teaching, and a targeted grammar approach. So that is how we're going to look to expand functional proficiency. In terms of socio-affective needs, we're going to focus on topics, that are listed there, that are known to be particularly important to HL learners. And then we want to be differentiated, right? We want to respond to individual variation that stems from the life experiences that HL learners have, which bear ultimately on their proficiency as well as their socio-affective needs. All right, so let's start with a poll. And here we go. Let me launch that poll. And in the poll, I'm asking you about the three dimensions of HL teaching. When it comes to HL teaching, which of the following is your strongest skill? And then when it comes to HL teaching, which of the following is your greatest area of need? Can you guys see? You can see the poll, right? So let's see how you're doing. Getting there. Okay, looks like 29 of you have, 30 of you have answered. "31, maybe it's time to stop it." Oh, 33, okay. Okay, so let me stop it and see what the answers are. So in terms of strengths, it looks like attending to HL learners' socio-affective needs comes out on top. And at the bottom of those three comes differentiating instruction. And not surprisingly, look at question number 2. The weakest area for most people seems to be differentiating instruction. So what I learned from this is that there might be a need for a workshop on differentiation. Today, I'm just going to share 3 tools of differentiation, but maybe this is something that we need to address in a future workshop. All right, so now that we've done polling, let's start with the overarching linguistic goal of expanding broad-based or functional proficiency, right? All right. So as I mentioned way at the beginning, we want to look, we're going to talk about 3 principles that will help you build functional proficiency when you're dealing with HL learners. Let's start, and these address 2 issues in heritage language teaching. On the one hand, we see that HL learners can do a lot with language. So what we want to do is build on what they can do. So take advantage of what they can do. The front two principles help with that, as well as macro-based teaching. These two, remember there were three strategies. These two strategies, the front two principles and macro-based teaching, are designed to build on what learners bring to the classroom. On the other hand, we also know that HL learners have knowledge gaps or skills gaps too, right? And this results from the fact that input to the HL, the target language, is interrupted before language acquisition is complete. And so what we need to do is fill in, address those gaps, those knowledge gaps. And for that, we have the third strategy, targeted grammar and vocabulary instruction. All right, so let's start with the from two principles. They were first proposed by Olga Kagan, and you have them here as she first proposed them. On the left, where it starts with listening, are the from part. You go from listening to reading. That's a way to understand the progression here. From speaking to writing, from home-based register to general academic register, from everyday real-life activities to classroom activities, and from HL learners' motivations, experiences, goals, to the content of what you're teaching. So the idea is that you're building on what they bring to the class, right? Focusing on those that involve the 4 skills. Let's have you in the chat write these 4 skills that are listed there, which one is the strongest in HL learners. Okay, I'm seeing that everybody knows this. Exactly. Listening is the strongest. And now let's have you write the weakest skill. Correct. Almost everybody's writing. Although speaking, somebody wrote speaking can be a weak skill depending on the proficiency level we are talking about. Right? Okay, so now you got the idea of the from two principles. Once you identify the strongest and the weakest, and again, that can vary, you can work with the from two principles. So now my next task for the chat is to order all 4 skills for HL learners from strongest to weakest. So put, the first one we already saw, listening, comma, the next one, comma, and the last one being writing, or whatever you think the last one is. Okay, so I'm seeing Keiko maybe saying from listening to reading to speaking. Okay, so I'm seeing some variation. Okay, excellent. All right, so typically for but there's variation, okay, and you're right to propose different sequences, but for Spanish speakers in particular, it tends to be listening, speaking, reading, and writing. Right now, I'm going to ask you to think about L2 learners and do the same for L2 learners. Order the 4 skills. So go from the strongest, what's the easiest thing for them to do, to the most demanding, the hardest one. So let's see, Michael is saying, whoops, reading, writing, listening, and speaking. Okay. Mi Jong said reading, writing, speaking, and listening. Right. So there's some variation there, but you guys got the idea. When I think of my students, and again, this can vary, right? The L2 learners are very good with reading. That's pretty controllable. Then they go to writing, because there you get the chance to think about it, to correct yourself. Then speaking and listening, like real life listening, tends to be the most difficult for them. But I see some people put speaking as being more difficult. I think it's because we're thinking about it at different levels of proficiency, as we'll see soon. The point I want to make is, look, for my learners, for HL learners, listening is the strongest. For my L2 learners, listening is the weakest. For my HL learners, reading is among the hardest ones, and look, is the strongest one for my L2 learners, right? That's kind of why it's so difficult to teach in a mixed class. I said I wasn't going to talk about mixed classes very much, but I do want to start to show you how we think about teaching and why HL learners kind of run counter to that general direction in which we teach. Now, in addition to the 4 skills, Olga Kagan posited that you want to go from the home-based register, which is what HL learners are best at, to teaching them the general academic register, from real life activities that they're familiar that are familiar to them, to use those to create classroom activities and create content based on HL learners' motivations, experiences, goals, etc. So what this does, it creates a leveling up sequence for teaching HL learners. And here's an example of how you can use the from-to principles. You can start with a listening activity that involves the informal register. So an interview of somebody on the street, let's say if you can find such a thing on YouTube, right? Then you can move to the academic register, building on the vocabulary that they hear in an informal interview. You can move them to the academic register, have them read on the same topic. And from there, use the listening, what they learned listening, what they learned through the reading, to write using an academic register. Okay, so that's one sequence. Now I want to make a little parenthesis to go back to the L2 learners again. And my purpose again is not to talk about how to teach mixed classes, but rather to get you to think about how we normally structure things in an L2 class, and how it's kind of backwards with regard to what HL learners can do. So remember, the informal register was a starting point for HL learners in listening. Now I might want to create a sequence, but that's the end point with L2 learners, because they don't understand the informal register very much. They're only used to the academic register, which is what we teach in the classroom. So with an L2 learner, I might have them reading at first, and then move to writing, and then move to listening, right? So notice that the from-to principles are sort of backwards in L2 learners as compared to HL learners. So with HL learners, you typically want to go to listening, from listening to reading. So you watch the movie, you read the novel. With L2 learners, you want to maybe read the novel or short story and then watch the movie. Same thing goes with speaking and writing, right? So if let's say you're going to discuss the differences between the novel and the movie, you want to discuss them first and then write about them when it comes to HL learners. With L2 learners, on the other hand, you want to flip the script. They're going to write first to sort of organize their thoughts and think about vocabulary and how to express themselves, and then they'll be ready to discuss them in a semi-spontaneous way. So this goes across all pieces of the from-to principles. The HL and the L2 learners are mirror images of each other. So you need to keep that in mind when teaching HL learners, that you're kind of flipping the script, going backwards with respect to how you do it with L2 learners. And so here we see the first sort of opposite directions of teaching, right? In the from-to principles, we start from listening, whereas with L2 learners, the endpoint tends to be listening, etc. And we'll see more of this, okay? And hopefully also we'll be able to offer a workshop on mixed classes, right? Back to the from-to principles. After Olga published her initial version of the from-to principles, I published something else in 2016. And essentially I said, you know, the from-to principles are about going from the familiar to the unfamiliar. It's a scaffolding, right? And I'm going to post this article when we post this recording so you can actually read what I said. But the main idea is that expand beyond, you know, this listening to speaking and come up with different configurations, right? So you can do all sorts of configurations as long as you're going from an area of strength to an area of need. Now, focusing on listening to, we can see how we can go from listening to speaking, right? That's easy. It's easy to see in this direction, but is it possible to go in the other direction, speaking to listening? Typically, we don't think of going that way with HL learners, but we can think of it if we use the ACTFL proficiency guidelines. So we can have them speaking at the intermediate mid-level. And as it says there, speakers at the intermediate mid sub-level are able to handle successfully a variety of uncomplicated communicative tasks in straightforward social situations. So kind of straightforward, informal. And the topics include the self, the family, home, daily activities, as well as physical and social needs such as food, shopping, travel, and lodging. And I've underlined travel for a reason. We look at listening at the advanced level, we can see that the topic of travel appears there too. So now we can see, maybe we can go from speaking about travel at the intermediate level to listening about travel at the advanced level, right? And we're going to use HL speakers' background knowledge to help them fill in information. So that's a characteristic of the advanced level. They compensate for limited lexical and structural complexity by using real world knowledge. So if we're talking about travel, we can bring in information that they have about their country of heritage, and then we can use that in addition to the first speaking activity to help them listen at the advanced level and understand something that's much more complex than what they can produce speaking, right? So notice how we have used learners' everyday activities and their experiences, if they know something about their HL country, to create content and a classroom activity. Again, exemplifying how to use the from-to principles in HL teaching. Give me 1 second. So there are 2 people in the waiting room. Okay, so this gives us another leveling up sequence. And so we can use home-made registers and students' experiences, right, to speak informally about a topic. In this case, we talked about travel, but it could be any number of topics at the intermediate mid-level. I'm choosing intermediate mid because that seems to be the level at which my students speak. But it doesn't have to be. You can change that. The point is that you're going to start with real world knowledge and interpersonal at a level that they're comfortable with. And you're going to use that to start moving, following the from-to principles, to the academic register. And maybe a good starting point is listening, right, at the advanced mid. Notice now I've kicked it up using the ACTFL proficiency guidelines. I'm using formal language, and notice now I'm building on their interpretive skills, the real world knowledge that they have about their HL country, plus everything else that has come out with this interpersonal exchange that we started the conversation with, right? And then slowly we build up to writing at advanced low, maybe level, right? Or to give a presentation. That's a presentational mode. So notice how we go from the strength, again, to a weakness or an area in need of development, right? Okay. All right. I want to point something out. You may have noticed that I talked about interpersonal, interpretive, and presentational. And notice this is ACTFL, Partnership for 21st Century Skills. And in the past, they say teachers focus on isolated skills, listening, speaking, reading, and writing. In the present, we want to focus on all 3 modes. And that's exactly the sequence that I have shown you. Notice how we see the sequence in interpersonal, interpretive, and presentational being bound together and building on each other. Okay, so let me move forward. I got to go through this. Okay, so the take-home lesson about the from-to principles is you can move up, you can use them to move up the ACTFL proficiency guidelines, right? Starting with where your students are, kick it up, typically 1 sub-level. With some work, you can kick it up 2 sub-levels, right? But notice you can also move across the guidelines in terms of the 4 skills and the 3 modes of communication: interpretive, interpersonal, and presentational. And then you can use those last 2 bits from the from to principles to help you create activities and content for HL learners. Let me stop for a second and see if there are any questions. No? Okay. Raise your hand. Alejandro and Sybil will see you. Put something in the chat, and Alejandro and Sybil will help out. Okay. So I want to go back to this everyday real life activities to create classroom activities. Remember, this is the 4th from to principle. Okay. And I'm going to use it to segue into macro-based teaching. We can think about teaching as going in 2 directions. On the left is macro or top-down teaching. And that is where you start with an authentic task, let's say a reading, watching a movie, right? And then you discuss it and you do real life things with it. What you do when you do a reading, right? What you do after you watch a movie, you discuss it with your friends. And then after you've done the real life activity, you move to form focus instruction. Think about this as what you do in a language arts class, in an English class, if you went to school as a native speaker of English, right? You read a short story and then you talked about it. You didn't start out by talking about the grammar within the reading, right? That's macro, top down. Micro is the opposite. Micro is the kind of thing that we see in our language textbooks. You start focusing on form. Remember, so think about your textbooks. They typically start with, in this lesson, we're going to learn how to talk in the past, or we're going to learn home vocabulary. And then at the end of the unit, you get to the reading or the writing activity. So that's the opposite direction, right? I do want to point out, however, that both macro and micro have form focus explicit instruction, but they differ as to when it happens and why it happens. And we'll get to why. We already saw when, right? With macro, it's second to the authentic task. With micro, it precedes the authentic task. In macro-based teaching, form-focused instruction happens, as I said, after the real-life activity has taken place and for the purpose of engaging more deeply with that activity, right? So let me relate to you an experience. I wrote a few textbooks for L2 learners, and we had a list of grammar topics that needed to be covered, as well as vocabulary topics. So we would start out with this, and then we would find readings that hopefully included the grammar points and the vocabulary that we wanted. So notice we were designing a unit, a chapter. Each of the chapters was designed going micro, but it was this thing that was kind of moving everything, propelling us to the end in finding those readings, right? With HL teaching, it's the other way around. You want to start with a topic, a reading, a movie, a discussion that's really interesting. And then you want to fill in gaps, right? That students need in order to fully engage with that task. Just a few little things. This chart is too much for now. And by the way, this PowerPoint will be posted, but you can see with macro base, you start out with real language, real readings, unaltered text, which is exactly what we want, right? That's the ideal. Whereas with micro, think about your text, but you start out with little texts that have been simplified, and then you start adding as you move through the unit and through the book, right? In terms of speaking and listening, we have talked about listening. With HL learners, you want to start macro-based, which is real input, right? Whereas with micro, with our L2 learners, because they can't do that much, you want to kind of start out with very restricted listening, or maybe even if they're listening to the whole thing, you want to focus on a specific little piece, precisely to help them to scaffold the activity, the listening activity for them, right? So I've already given this line away. Learners for this approach, well, native speakers, that's the way native speakers approach things, right? I said a language, think of a language arts class. That's precisely what we do in a language arts class, or what we do in a science class or social studies class, right? We read something, we talk about it, and in the process, we learn vocabulary and grammatical structures, right? HL learners, you also want to do this with HL learners. You want to start with a real life task, right? I put cognate speakers. I saw that there's some teachers of Chinese. If you're teaching Mandarin, there might be speakers in your class that speak languages, a language of China that shares a lot of vocabulary with Mandarin, right? Or even some structures with Mandarin. Those are cognates because they're not quite HL speakers of the target language, but they bring a lot of knowledge to the classroom, right? If you're teaching Spanish, Portuguese speakers and maybe Italian speakers can be your cognate speakers because they start out with a lot of vocabulary, right? Advanced L2 learners, right? Think of a literature class. You start out reading the novel, right? Micro, well, L2 learners at our lower levels of proficiency. HL learners, sometimes they're very, very low, at a very low level of proficiency. And forget learners with an HL motivation. It's not important right now, right? But again, the point is we have now added another area of contention or discrepancy between how we teach HL learners and how we teach L2 learners. With HL learners, you want to go top down, macro base. Whereas with L2 learners, you want to go bottom up, micro base. So again, I'm not going into this to teach you how to do mixed classes, but to get you to think about inverting some of the things that you've been doing very well with L2 learners. Now you have to turn them upside down when you're dealing with HL learners. And again, if you have a question, anytime, put it in the chat or raise your hand and we'll get to you. And if we don't see you, I don't know, make noise. All right. So why use macro approaches? Well, because it's more authentic, right? And it engages them in materials that, in a way that they naturally use language, right? So, and it's also more engaging from the start. Who wants to start, before you start a movie, is, hey, let's make a list of the vocabulary words we're going to see. You want to jump into that movie and enjoy it, right? And it's also more conducive to learning because it involves something called interleaving grammar instruction. When I learned this was a big aha moment for me. We tend to break HLT language teaching into little bits, and we focus, if it's going to be the future tense, we focus really hard on the future tense, and we isolate it from everything. And then once we're done working with the future, we move to the conditional, let's say. And then we do everything again with the conditional, where we isolate it and we really work on it. Well, it turns out there's a lot of research that shows that mass practice, so 1 point at a time, what I just explained, is not as good as interleave practice. It's not as good in terms of remembering and learning. So it's good to interleave. You can always focus on one thing or another, but when you mix it up in a real world way, it's more effortful. And typically what is more effortful is better learned in the long run. Yes, Alejandro.
Hi, Maria. There is a question. When do you teach vocabulary in the macro approach?
So I generally have a sense of what words they're going to know and what words they're not going to know. And then I ask myself, of the ones that they don't know, which ones do they absolutely need to know to start working with this reading, this movie, whatever it is, this discussion, right? If there's stuff that is going to come up and it's essential, I pre-teach that, right? If it's not essential, I let it go. I hope that they can guess what it means. Or if they can't guess, as the need comes up, I say, oh, okay, this is a word we should review before we keep going. But typically, I don't start with, let's make a list of vocabulary words. That's what you need to do with L2 learners, because they're very restricted in the vocabulary that they know, but not so with HL learners. Did I answer your question, whoever it was that posed the question? Okay, so why? Here's another, pardon me, a really good reason to use macro approaches. Engagement. And this is a great study. I bring it up in just about every workshop I give, no matter what the topic is. This was a study by Kim Helmer, and it appeared in the Heritage Language Journal. And I believe its title is just a story to learn Spanish. It's not real. And what Kim did was she studied a high school class for an entire year. This was a class, an HL class in Los Angeles. And she was struck by the fact that students were not cooperating, right? They were rebelling. She used the word rebelling. She couldn't quite figure out why they were rebelling, because the teacher was really trying his best and was being communicative in his approach. He wasn't just asking them to conjugate things. And this is what she said. She heard a student say, oh, we're not paying attention because it's just a story to learn Spanish. It's not real. And this is what she concluded from that comment. This might serve as an explanation of why students did not engage in the discussion, because students' exposure to and use of Spanish have been highly contextualized and communicative. Designing curricula that emulate naturalistic, authentic context should have been a goal of this class. There's your macro. There's your argument for macro. Authentic. Macro starts with an authentic task. Let's talk about this great story or this great topic that's in the news, right? And there's also the from-to principle of using students' experiences and their use of language, the natural use of language, to create content and activities. Now I want to go back to this point I made earlier about form-focused instruction. Remember, I mentioned with macro-based, it happens after the real life activity at least has gotten started, because that's how you hook students. You don't want them doing what they did in the class that Kim Helmer observed, where they rebelled and they weren't going along with anything. You want to capture them. The way to do it is with macro, with an interesting topic, right? So what about form focus? Alejandro, I see you have your hand up.
Sorry, there's another question.
Yes, please.
It's pretty long. How many new structures can really be used in the interleave practice? Is it better to use some concepts they are comfortable with and add in some new ideas like the past tense they're comfortable with, and add in a perfect tense or subjunctive, or a bunch of tenses and ideas at once?
Okay, so the idea of interleave is you want to mix it all up, because that's real life, right? In real life, things are not isolated. Oh, I'm just going to talk about the past tense right now. No, I might be going back to I might be talking about the past and coming to the present and then projecting to the future, right? But the question is well taken, because if we have been taught, right, that you got to be careful, for instance, when you correct, you don't want to be correcting a lot of things. You want to have some focus correction. Right. So to answer your question, you want to have it both ways. You want to have authentic language, and authentic language mixes it all up. Right. You don't want to do what's done with micro, where you simplify it and you're just focusing on a little bit. Right. But at the same time, you want to put the focus on where it needs to be. And the focus is on what the language bids that it takes to complete the activity, whatever task it is that they're going to do, right? So you throw it all in there, but not everything is equally important. You as a teacher, you're the conductor of that orchestra. You are deciding where you want them to be looking and what they will need in terms of vocabulary and grammatical structures in order to engage in an activity. I hope I answered that question. If not, I can come back. All right. So now I'm going to go to the third one. Remember, there was from two principles, macro. Now we're going to go to form focus instruction. The third bit, which is targeted form focus instruction. Oh, Alejandro, I see your hand is up again. Is that right? Oh, can't hear you. Oh, I see.
No, sorry.
Oh, you're taking your hand out. I always forget. All right. All right. So notice what happens with L2 teaching. Think about your textbook. Grammar explanations start from 0, and progressively add details and complications as proficiency grows, right? So you start by conjugating the verb to be, and at that point you've lost the HL learners, right? Who wants to conjugate the verb to be? Or you're talking about mom and dad and grandma and grandpa. My goodness, this is what they know. But if you're following an L2 book, you have to go through this sequence because that's the way the L2 book takes you from zero, and then you start building. HL teaching is more chaotic. So we want to, the first part is not so chaotic. You want to target specific topics known to be problematic for this population. And I'm going to mention them in a second. And then you always want to go back to what I said. Okay, what is the communicative task we're going to do in the classroom? And what are my top priorities in terms of completing that communicative task? What language pieces are going to be necessary for completing that communicative task? So even though we have a list of things that we know from research, and guys, you know, because you teach what HL learners cannot do. So we have this long list. Rather than moving through the list, you're asking yourself, okay, my students are going to do this. This is the task I'm aiming for. What are the grammatical structures that I have to prioritize to get them to do this task? I'll show you that in a second, but here we come to the third confrontation. Remember, with HL learners, you're going to go from listening. L2 learners, you want to end up to listening. With HL learners, you want to do macro-based. With L2 learners, you want to do micro-based. These going opposite directions, right? And with HL learners, you want to do targeted grammar instruction. With L2 learners, on the other hand, we teach grammar in a comprehensive way that starts from zero. You can see again now why mixed classes are such a headache, right? We're being asked to do two opposite things at the same time. Okay, so what are those specific grammar points? I have some of those listed there for Spanish, but what I really want to tell you, and I've read the literature, the research literature, you as teachers know really well what your learners can't do. You're experienced, you've seen enough essays, you've heard them enough to know what they cannot do. So you can always turn to the literature to get more details, but if you keep your eyes open and you listen, you will be very good after a certain period of time at making a list. I like to keep about 5 to 7 topics in my pocket that I constantly come back to, and where I have a lot of worksheets and things like that. Those are the high priority topics for me. But it doesn't mean that I exclude others. Remember, if the communicative task calls for others, I bring those up too. All right, and there's the bit, right? The communicative act determined the selection of instructional topics and the treatment of errors too, right? So I have these 7 topics that I focus on, and I've listed some of them there. And then, the subjunctive, if you teach Spanish, the predicate imperfect, if you teach Spanish, the conditional, some irregular genders, etc., right? But it's a communicative act that drives everything. Let me show you what I mean. I teach a project-based class. It's called Spanish for the Professions, right? And in this class, students create a resume, a cover letter, in that order. And then at the very end of the semester, they engage in a mock job interview, right? So now, at the beginning of the semester, I ask myself, what do they need to get to the end? That's backward design. But I also ask myself, for each piece as it comes along, what are they going to need? So notice I don't start out with my list of 5 to 7 topics. I start out with the task that they're going to have to complete, creating that resume or CV, right? And the CV, if you look at the actual proficiency guidelines, you will see that's intermediate level writing. It's intermediate because it doesn't have paragraphs. They're really loose sentences. There's a lot still of formulaic language, which is a little bit at the novice level, right? But what we use it for is orthographic, to learn orthographic conventions. This is where we learn field-specific vocabulary. So if my students are creating a CV and they want to be in the health professions, this is where they investigate the vocabulary that they're going to have to do. And genre conventions for the resume. In a resume, if you look at a resume, you'll see that it doesn't have long paragraphs. It might have a little paragraph, a profile at the top, but it's really phrases and very short phrases. And what's interesting is that in Spanish, if you look at a resume, it's got a lot of nouns. In English, it has a lot of past participles: design, created, led, learned, participated in. So if you're teaching resume writing in English, you focus on past participles. If you're doing it in Spanish, as I do it, I focus on nouns. Nominalization is the word in linguistics, right? So then once we finish this, we move to a cover letter. This is at a higher level now. So notice I'm using the ACTFL proficiency guidelines in a from to way. It's all writing, but I'm moving up the ACTFL proficiency guidelines. Now, a letter is paragraph level writing, right? So that's at the advanced level. They're using the past tense. I did this. I studied that. I was trained in, as well as some present perfect. I have done something, maybe some future. So notice now we're interleaving, but the focus tends to be on the past tense. And that's where I'm putting my focus. And if they need a little bit of help with the future, I help out, right? And then there's also the letter writing conventions. How do you structure a letter? How do you open a letter? How do you close a letter? How do you move from one paragraph to the other, right? So that's what I'm teaching when I get there, right? Some of those topics are in my 7 topics, like the past tense, the present perfect, right? Field specific vocabulary, right? But I'm not starting with that. I figured that out because the task called for it. And then the advanced high speaking, that's discourse level speaking. So now it's connected paragraphs, and they have to deal with an unexpected complication. So I want to make sure that my students who are acting as interviewers can ask follow-up questions. And I want to make sure that my students who are being interviewed can answer something that's a little bit more complex, not just what they came prepared to answer. Right? So that's how I choose the topics. Notice it's all driven by the task, macro based. And there's a lot of language that's copied, that's created here, right? And that's learned and practiced here. Question formation, right? That's basic in the ACTFL proficiency guidelines. Past narration, right? Discourse level, etc. So there's a lot here. Now, in terms of tolerance for errors, with the CV and the cover letter, because it's written, I have less tolerance for errors. We work through this slowly, right? So there, I hope that by the time they get to the end of these pieces of writing, it's pretty much error-free, because they've written a little bit of it, I've corrected it, or asked them to focus on something, they've edited it, and they fixed it up. On the other hand, for the job interview, I have a lot more tolerance for errors, because they have to use strategies to compensate for things that they may not know how to say on the spot. And also because they may lack some vocabulary, and there might be something so complicated that they haven't thought about it at any ahead of time. All right, so that's the main idea. Is this: you want to spot treat grammar. Sybil had something to say about this spot treatment of grammar, that it suggests that, and I agree with her, that maybe HL learners are dirty. That's true. It does suggest it, but that's not at all what I mean to suggest by this picture. The idea is, don't wash out the entire garment. Do you ever get home from a party and you've only worn the garment for 2 hours? Your garment is pretty good. You don't need to spend money at the dry cleaners, right? You just want to kind of treat that little spot. You don't have to do the whole thing, right? And then you also, again, want to focus on the communicative function. That's what's driving everything you're teaching in terms of grammar and vocabulary. Whoops, what just happened? Oh, it just quit on me. Let's try it again. Huh. Okay, this is crazy. Give me 1 second. Maybe while I'm doing that, we can, how did that happen? We can, Alejandro, if there are questions, or Sybil, if there are questions. I apologize. I don't know how that happened.
Yeah, if there are any questions, you can type them in the chat or raise your hand.
Oh, there's somebody trying to get in. Okay. Oh my goodness. Okay. So now I can't find it. Give me a second. I apologize. HLX. Oh, okay. Where's that folder? HLX and Okay, I'm very sorry. Now I'm freaking out because I wasn't expecting this to happen. Applications, let me open PowerPoint and then from there open recent Microsoft PowerPoint. Microsoft, here goes. Okay. Oh, now it's opening a million files. Okay. Let me just, okay, let me close that. Pardon me, huh? Okay, this is kind of like the nightmare scenario for me. Now that I was okay, I survived it. Let me screen share. Can you guys, you can't see that, right? No. Okay. So let me share screen. Here it is. Share screen. Okay. So now we were pretty far down. Yeah, now we were ready to move. So we had now seen all three, the from to principles, macro-based teaching, and targeted grammar instruction. So now that we've done sort of in a quick way, but you have a bird's eye view of what it means to expand broad-based or functional proficiency, we can move to the socio-affective domain, which is a very important dimension of HL teaching. Right? And on the left, I have listed the linguistic dimensions that we already saw. And now we're going to start talking about these social and emotional factors that are really just as important as language when we're talking about HL teaching, and that really distinguish HL learners from L2 learners and native speakers. Because remember, our HL learners are not native speakers. They're bilingual speakers of your target language in English, and typically they are dominant in English. And I'm going to read you a piece from a book I wrote on Latino students, where I collected stories and thoughts by narratives by Latino students. And this was really probably the most perceptive of all comments. And I collected a lot of very perceptive comments, but it's an eye-opener for HL teaching. The student says, in school, I was considered Mexican because I spoke Spanish, but I was considered pocho, that's a pejorative term, by my dad's family because my Spanish was not up to their standard. It's this weird duality in which you're stuck in the middle. Latinos are often told that they're not Americans, but also that they're not connected to their heritage. You take pride in both cultures and learn to deal with the rejection. You may never be fully embraced by either side. That's why you seek out other people like yourself. Socializing with people who share a common experience helps you deal with this experience. So if there is ever a shorthand analysis or summary of what it means to teach HL learners, there it is. You want to help them deal with the rejection, understand that they're never going to be like monolingual speakers of Spanish, in my case, or Chinese, German, and they're never also probably not going, well, they're not going to be monolingual speakers of English. You accept that, and you let them seek out other people such as themselves to understand themselves better and to learn from each other, language as well as culture, right? So this is a beautiful quote, which really encapsulates the whole socio-affective domain. Right? So this really, again, goes back to the from to principles, that you use HL learners' motivations, experiences, and goals to design content. That short narrative tells you what you want to do. You want to bring them together to interact about things that matter to them, right? Olga and I, in 2011, published a paper in Foreign Language Annals where we gave the results of a survey, a national survey that we gave to HL learners. And we found that they're college students, so adolescent and a little older, the 20s, young 20s. And these were the top 4 reasons for studying their HL in order of importance: finding identity, communicating with family and friends in the US, communicating with speakers of the HL outside the US, and pursuing professional goals. But I must say about professional goals that with Spanish and at the time Japanese, professional goals were number one. I suspect that if the survey were to be given today, 10 years later, no, 11, because it wasn't given in 2011, professional goals would rank much higher, maybe number one, number two, for most, if not all, languages, because as we have become increasingly globalized, professional goals have become much more important for HL learners. But this information gives you some idea of how to design activities that respond to their experiences, to their goals, etc. So in the chat, I want you to write down some HL specific goals or the topics that you, when you think HL topics, let's say you're going to design a curriculum and you're going to choose reading, what are some topics that you want to, that come to mind? Let me see. Travel, yes. Identity, right? Identity is really big. Cultural events, right? Sports, accomplishments of immigrants in the US, food, ethno-linguistic identity, excellent, cultural diversity, travel, sports, holidays, exactly. Modern pop culture, I know with Korean, that's super important. Diversity, understanding family history, understanding themselves. And, you know, you may remember from the quote I just read to you by the student who talked about rejection from both sides, issues of ownership. Do I own my language? COVID, Alejandra says COVID. Yes, yes, modern time, mainstream things going on. But issues of where do I belong? Do I own the target language, or does the language belong to the native speakers? That also seems important. Do I have a say as to how things should be said? These make for very, very rich conversations. And I know Claudia Olguin, who's an expert on this, is with us here today. And maybe at the end, I'm planning on staying until 5:30. Maybe we can have her say something. She doesn't mind. I'm putting her on the spot here. The value behind names, Carmen is saying, yes, names are a very good way to explore the past and how we connect to our culture. How names are said is also interesting. Social media, good. So here's some ones that I thought of, but I think you've identified them all in terms of HL, finding identity, understanding themselves, life between two languages and cultures, right? I often have my students create the world that their ideal world. And I say, put on that list anything you like from your own culture and anything you like from American culture. And you can make ethnic labels. I'm seeing Ruby say, right? And you can create your own perfect world, drawing from each of your worlds. Bilingualism, what does it mean to be bilingual? Career goals, home culture, the dominant culture in the US. Linguistic insecurities are big. Prejudice they encounter, generational differences, they're fascinated by that. Immigration, you can keep going, as well as some of the other ones that you identified, right? Some general things that are in your textbook: science, the arts, hobbies, music, etc., sports. The reason why I mention these is because we know that HL learners go through 4 stages of HL identity development. Not all of them get to the final identity. When they start out, when they're very little, before they start school, they're not aware of the fact that they're different. So you can have them do anything and they don't care. They don't rebel. They're happy to go along. The mom and dad are doing it. And, you know, everybody else is doing it great. But then when they start school, they notice they're different and they're going to reject that HL because they don't want to stick out like a sore thumb. Okay, so this is when they say, I don't want to speak the HL. There's a rejection there, right? When they get to high school and college, there's ethnic emergence and they really want to go full throttle on exploring their identity. And some people get to identity incorporation, which is where that learner was that I read from, where you say you take pride in, you know, in both of your sides and you accept the rejection and you live as you are, you kind of accept yourself. But the point is, if you're learners, I notice some of you are teaching in elementary school. I sort of could tell from your email address. If your learners are at a stage of ambivalence, Forget the age, talking about culture and everything else. Talk about sports, music, social media, food and traditions, right? Things that don't put them in the hard spot of having to identify with their culture if they don't want to at that point. You just want to keep them engaged in whatever it is that they're interested in. And probably the most important thing I can tell you is to survey your students about their interests, motivations, and life experiences, because we know from research the topics that we all listed there are things that interest our students, right? Did somebody list environment, by the way? Because environment is also a topic that they're all very interested in. So it's a very good topic. But that's what the researchers tell us, who are old enough in most cases to be grandparents to these children. The way you really learn what your students want to do is to, social justice, good, Alejandro, is to survey them. And I survey them constantly. Surveying is essential to differentiating instruction. And now I'm going to the third dimension of HL teaching, right? It's this learner diversity. In a classroom, you may have a learner who arrived in the United States at age 10, by which time we know that the language is quite developed. It's not all the way up to what a native speaker adult would have, but pretty developed. All the basic structures are there. And the student I have friends who come from Argentina and very, very comfortable being Hispanics and very happy. And so they arrive with one mindset. And in the same classroom, I may have a second or a third generation Latino whose Spanish will not be as strong, and also who have suffered discrimination. Right? So their mindset is going to be very different, right? And so the pedagogical implication of this is that you want to respond to learner differences, right? Now, I don't have time to give you a workshop on differentiation. That would take a long time, but I'm going to tell you about the three strategies or tools that I use most often in my teaching. Frankly, the best strategy I use is project-based learning. And I'm going to give a workshop on project-based learning. Project-based learning is perfect for HL teaching, for mixed classes, for expanding functional skills, perfect differentiation, but that's a different workshop. So for now, let me just give you three tools of differentiation that are sitting next to that list of 5 to 7 topics. I have these three tools that I pull out of my pocket all the time: the exit card, flexible grouping, and the agenda. I'm going to start out by showing you how I use these three tools to expand broad-based proficiency. Okay, exit cards are also called ticket out the door, exit slips, exit tickets, and they're really short assignments that students in my class complete the last 10 minutes of class, 5-10 minutes, and they turn in to me as they're leaving class. And I use this to survey my students. Remember, surveying is key to differentiating instruction, right? So I use it as formative assessment. And by the way, I also use it for the attendance and participation grade. So I don't give attendance based on how many times they raise their hands. That's really difficult to keep track of who's talking. And also I don't rely on my memory, because especially as I get older, my memory keeps going down. So I use the exit cards for that. So here is how I use the exit cards to support language development. And this is not so much functional proficiency per se, but language development in a more broader way. So I can use the exit card to give learners a roadmap to learning. So for those of you that teach Spanish, accents are a pain in the behind. So my prompt might say to my learners, hey, to write accents, you need to be able to hear where the word falls, where the accent falls in a word. I've done this in class, right? That was the lesson for the day. You need to hear where the accent falls in a word. You have to know the basic rules of accentuation, and you have to practice it until the process becomes automatic. Assess your abilities in each of these skills. So now they're sitting there filling out the exit card the last 10 minutes of class, and they're thinking, I think I can hear it. Yeah, but if I do what she tells me to do, I can hear it. The rules, not so much. Practice, forget it. So they turn in this information to me. I take my exit cards home. I read through them. Oh, by the way, sorry, before I do that, let me show you how I use this to encourage metacognition and independence, right? I'm telling the students how they have to think about their own learning. In the prompt, I have embedded a recipe for learning accents. I've already taught it in class, and this isn't probably the first thing I would do. I would do it after 2 or 3 lessons on this. But notice I'm reminding them now, this is how you do it. And I've used the prompt, the exit card for that. For programs, if I collect enough of these, we can get a better sense of how long it takes to learn accents or when to teach them or what are the difficult things, right? And for me, on a day-to-day basis, it enables me to respond to the needs of all my learners, to know where they are and what they need to focus on, right? So I get my exit cards home and I look and I say, oh, it looks like 10 students can't hear it. See, if you can't hear it, you can't go any further, right? So I think I'm going to meet with them tomorrow. I'm going to give a mini lesson. I have all sorts of tricks for getting them to hear the accent. So I decided I'm going to meet with them. Then there's some students that just need to practice a lot. That's another group. And then there's going to be a second group that really needs to review the rules and apply them, right? So notice now, these little exit cards have given me a way to create flexible grouping, which is the second strategy or tool that I use all the time in my teaching. You need to think about 2 operations that are essential to flexible grouping. You have to know where your students are. And that's what the exit cards give me. They give me that information. But it doesn't have to be exit cards. If you're collecting homework, you're getting that information. If you're watching how they're responding to your questions, you're getting that information too. The point is you have to gather information on your students before you can create groups that are well designed from the point of view of attending to the needs of individual learners. Now you've created these groups. Let's say you've got 3 groups, a scenario I set up. I'm going to be working with 10 students because I want to hear them saying the words and emphasizing things in a certain way that I know helps students hear the accent. And I have 2 other groups. Remember, one of them has to learn the rules a little more, and the other one just has to practice. Okay, so I have 3 groups. When I'm giving my mini lessons, I know the students that are with me are paying attention. But what do you think the other 2 groups are going to be doing? Well, I don't know what very young people do, but I can tell you what I would do. I would be shopping for shoes, which is what I can't stop myself from doing. I go on that online stores, and I start looking for shoes. Right? I'm saying, unless you give them something important to do, something that they're going to want to do, they are not going to engage in work. And that brings us to the agendas. And agendas are a strategy for keeping students busy, but in a meaningful and valuable way while you're engaging in a mini lesson. Or if students are working at different rates in their little groups, it's a way to keep them busy. This is what an agenda from my class, right? So I usually give them 1 to 2 weeks to complete this material. I collect the homework. Maybe with college students, it's okay to do it every 2 weeks. Maybe with high school students, you want to do it every week, something like that. It's up to you to decide. Notice, by the way, that this activity that is from Blackboard targets each of those 3 skills: listening, applying the rules, and then learning the rules, and then number 3, applying the rules. So I have designed the agenda with that earlier activity that I presented. Now, what's so great about an agenda? Well, as I said, an agenda enables your students. Let's say you're working with you're giving a mini lesson to the students who can't hear. Students who can't hear the location of the accent, the rest of the class, if they're done with their other activities, can start working through the agenda. And why are they going to want to do that? Because the more they do in class, the less they're going to have to do at home, right? In class, they also have the opportunity to work together through this agenda so they can get help, right? Here is another reason besides supporting mini lessons and flexible grouping. Agendas are great because they make it possible to vary pacing. And I'm going to give you an example from real life. I have this kid Francis. Alejandro knows him. He's a wonderful kid. But when he was in high school, he's a wonderful young man, by the way. But when he was in high school, he was a little bit scatterbrained. So this is what he did to me one week. I swear to you, this is what he did to me. It was Sunday night. And he says to me, oh, Mom, I need $140 for, oh, what was it? The track uniform. And I said, well, Francis, I don't have $140 sitting at home. But yesterday I went to the grocery store where there's an ATM machine. I could have gotten $140. Why didn't you tell me then? And he goes, oh, I'm sorry. I forgot about that. I said, I'll write you a check. He goes, no, can't be a check. It's got to be cash. Okay. So Sunday night, I go out to the ATM to get the $140. Great. Monday night comes around. I swear to you, this happened in 1 week. Monday night comes around and he goes, oh, Mom, I need to take 3 big bottles of Coke for tomorrow because we're having a party in Spanish class. I go, oh my God, I have made 2 trips in the last 3 days to the grocery store. Why didn't you tell me so I could have gotten the Coke back then? Oh, I forgot. Okay, so then I go out again. Thursday night rolls around and he says, Mom, I need science paper. I go, oh my God, why didn't you tell me this before? But my husband was still at school. And I said, I'm going to call him. He can go to the store and buy the science paper. Well, as it turns out, my husband had already left school, so he couldn't get to the store and buy the science paper. So guess what? On the way home, my husband had to stop at Target and get science paper. If my son had given me an agenda Saturday, I would have been able to pace myself and take care of everything without having to run at the last minute. That's the power of agenda to vary pacing. Students that need more help can get going on the things that they need more help with plenty of time to get there at the end and to achieve the objectives for the instructional objectives, right? So that's why agendas are a very powerful tool for differentiating instruction. Instead of assigning, it's a simple task. Instead of assigning assignments from one day to the next, create a 1 week at a time. And if you've taught enough times the same course, you can do that. You can always vary it a little bit, but that's the idea. Now, let me show you how I use these 3 tools to address students' socio-affective needs. So that's done with exit cards too. So I might ask any of these prompts, identify 1 to 2 ideas from reading today and class discussion that are of particular significance for you and explain why you selected these ideas. React to a comment or an idea shared by a student in class today. Identify an issue, a topic from today's class that you would like to explore further. Share an idea that's important to you, but you were not comfortable bringing up in front of the class. I have undocumented students in my class, and when the conversation veers towards that, they're very uncomfortable talking. The exit card gives them the opportunity to express themselves without revealing something that they're very uncomfortable with. So notice what these do for me. If students tell me that they're interested in a topic, then I can, or in something somebody say, I can create flexible groupings so that they can discuss those topics, right? Recall what my students said in my book, right? They want to interact with people who are like them. So this information helps me create flexible grouping where they can discuss things that they're really interested in. If enough students tell me that they want to research a topic, or if I find that the class finds 3 on the whole, they identify 3 topics that they're interested in, I can put it in my next agenda and put an assignment and say, choose one of these 3 and do X. Notice how it becomes responsive to whatever it is that they're interested in. Right? That's the power of exit cards, a form of surveying students. And then when combined with flexible grouping and the agenda, they really make it possible for you to differentiate instruction. So ready to summarize? I have 2 minutes. 3 dimensions of HL teaching. You want to think about the from-to principles, macro-based teaching, and targeted grammar instruction. In terms of socio-affective needs, you want to focus on identity, navigating 2 languages and cultures, linguistic insecurity, belonging, and ownership. Does the language belong to you, or does it belong to native speakers? Above all, You want to survey your students, because what you think your students might be interested in, they might not actually be all that interested in. And you want to respond to individual variation. You can use exit cards, surveys, any number of issues to get to understand where they are. And then you use flexible groupings and agendas to address their particular needs. And with that, oh, I'm going to surprise Alejandro. I see that there's a question.
Yes. Monica wants to know, these exit card questions are excellent. Do you have additional reading recommendations on the topic of responding to students' socio-affective needs?
Yes, and I can put that article when we post the recording. I will put that article on. Yes, additional recommendations. Oh, Claudia is here. Claudia, are you still here? I'm not sure. I saw her sign in.
Here I am.
Okay. Do you want to
Yeah.
say? Do you want to answer something there?
Yeah. Let me see. What is the question? I'm sorry.
So a topic, reading recommendations on the topic of responding to students' socio-affective needs.
Oh, yeah, there are many. So I'll include some in the chat. Okay. Let me.
Okay, you're going to include them in the chat. Okay, so then Jonathan, who is my student and whom I love, asked, are there other great and secure websites to get these readings? I'm just gonna, I understand your concern, Jonathan, but I'm just gonna post the readings on our HLX site. Is that
Great.
okay? Or are you
Yeah.
concerned, is there a concern of yours that?
No, that's perfect.
That's perfect. Okay, well, wonderful to hear your voice.
Thank you. Thank you.
Alejandro, I surprise you. Sorry, I meant to tell you this, but can you talk about your brag sheet? Because this is another excellent activity for supporting students' socio-affective needs.
Okay.
Surprise!
So when students ask me for letters of recommendation, I send them a brag sheet. This was shared by a counselor at Santa Monica College. So I'd like to give him credit, Paul Jimenez. And so they just have to fill out, you know, their biography, their curriculum, their awards, anything that you need to, you know to write a strong letter of recommendation. And many students actually need more help because they don't think that certain things that they did are very important in a letter of recommendation for a scholarship or to transfer to a four-year university. And so this is the opportunity for me to say, oh, tell me more about you were doing ceramics or you were a state champion for dance. Why didn't you write that in your letter, your statement of purpose when you applied to college? So I thought it wasn't important. It's actually, it is very important. You know, we need to know who you are. We want to see the entire picture. And this student, who was very humble, she received a full scholarship, a full ride to Mount Holyoke. So I'm very proud of her, and also to all the schools, Columbia, UCLA. But it doesn't occur to my students that they need to tell me these things. So I don't know what you want to show, but go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Alejandro. And you know what I'm going to try next time, I'm not teaching HL learners this semester, but I will be teaching them next semester. I'm going to use the can-do principles, the ACTFL can-do principles, to add on to their brag sheet. So we're going to go through them and say, oh, I can do this. I can talk about myself. I can read an article and discuss it, and slowly add these linguistic can-do statements as well as cultural ones, so that they start to get a sense of, hey, they actually know a lot. Right. And Claudia, I should mention that you should also include the article of yours that's coming out in Melissa Bowles' volume, because that's a very good article. Okay, so we'll post these. Okay, we'll post this information with the recording and the readings. Okay, next workshop. Now, the plan for the workshop was to do PBL. But as I was preparing this, it occurred to me that it might be, you might prefer mixed classes. Can I see it? Would it be possible for you to let us know what you would prefer, your preference for the next workshop? Thank you, Claudia. Yeah. Okay, I'm seeing PBL. Okay, all right, so here's what we do. Here, I'm seeing a lot of PBL as well as mixed classes. Next one will be on PBL. And then the one after that will be on mixed classes, okay? And we'll just keep asking you each time. Oh, I'm seeing both. Okay. Are there any other questions, comments? Alegria, you're here. Do you want to add something?
Oh, I have been loving this so much. I am so inspired. And I'm going to share this poem that I had my students listen today that is called My Spanish. And then I had them add a verse from their own perspective. And you would not believe the beautiful stuff they wrote. So I'm going to share that with you all right now because you've inspired me talking about the socio-affective issues.
There we go. Okay, multiple shares. There you go.
I love that we can all share this way.
Oh yeah,
Thank
let me
you
stop
so
sharing
much.
actually. Okay, there we go. Oh, it's in Spanish, right?
Yes, it
Wow.
is. But I'm sure there's something similar. Here it is. I
Okay.
just put it in the chat. I'm sure there's some activities you can do even if you don't have a poem like this. So we listened to it and you would not believe the beautiful verses they wrote. It just, now I'm going to print them on a poster board and I'm going to put them at the language center. It was that beautiful.
Wonderful. So
Highly
you
recommend
had
it,
them
actually.
listen to this poem and then kind of rewrite it from their perspective. Is that what you did?
From their perspective, yeah, and just one verse instead of a whole poem, and it was incredible. I never expected it to be as beautiful as it came out.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And I'm going to now put Sybil on the spot because she has a great activity for sharing stuff about yourself. Sybil, I know you're not going to be able to, this is
yeah, which one are you talking about?
the one where you use that app, the app where you talk about yourself and then you have your students, you present it on that. Yeah.
Right. It's the story map, and we'll have to post it later.
Okay.
But it's an invitation to have students tell their own story, and it does it in terms of it maps the story on a map, and it works very well. It can be as simple as you want. It can be audio. It can be in written form. I wasn't expecting this, Maria, so I don't have it easily.
No, I'm sorry, and I forgot to tell you both.
I have it. Can I share it?
Sure. Well, one thing I wanted to add was when we were talking about insecurity, when I asked my students at the beginning of the semester what they most wanted out of the class, the universal response was a safe place. They wanted a place where they could feel secure about using the language that they know. And not feeling belittled or degraded. They want to learn, but they want to be able to learn in a comfortable environment. And I think it's up to us to provide that environment and to, as Maria said, listen to your students, ask them. And those surveys should involve every aspect of teaching, and the socio-affective is one of the most important.
Well said, Sybil. So important because, if you lose them after the first course, they're not going to continue to learn. You want to keep them there as long as possible. And that might involve, when I do it, I kind of sacrifice the language a little bit at the expense of the socio-affective. I'm sorry, I focus on the socio-affective at the expense of language because my goal is that they will come back and keep coming back. And that's the way they learn.
Right, and I think building the sense of community is really important, and Yeah, it's just essential. And I think once you have that sense of community, then you can tackle the language more readily. But they have to feel comfortable first.
Right, exactly. Right. Okay. Any other questions or comments from anybody? Okay. Well, if that is it, we thank you all, and been a pleasure. Oh, there's more messages. Let's see. Oh, thank you to all of you for these messages. Thank you, and we'll see you hopefully next month for, what is it, PBL, maybe next month, and then December we will do mixed classes. Okay.
Thank you,
Bye-bye,
everybody.
everybody. Take care.
Bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you
Our
so
pleasure.
much.
Oh, pleasure. Thank you. Thank you. Okay.
Stop recording.